Good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you may be joining us from. And thank you for spending some time with us today on this really interesting topic about standards and methodologies in DCTs. And the subtext is what's new and what's not. Because while we're learning, I wonder how much we are overcomplicating as we try to drive the adoption of DCTs. And I'm really delighted to be joined today by three great colleagues and friends, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves in a moment. My name is Jane Myles. I'm the VP of Innovation for Clinical Trials at Curebase, which is a DCT software and services provider. And I also happen to spend a lot of time working with the Decentralized Trial Research Alliance. So you could say I'm in deep on DCT. But so are my three friends who are joining me today, and I've learned tons from each of them. So I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation. I will begin by asking Kim to introduce herself, and then she can hand off.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Barnholt. I am an evidence generation leader for U.S. Medical Affairs at Genentech. I am a scientist by training and first moved over into the pharma space, biotech space, after graduate school, leading digital patient community engagement and recruitment. From there, I joined Genentech. And I've been involved in a number of different initiatives looking at how we can streamline, how we can drive efficiencies, and how we can become more patient-centric. Some of these have been in the operations space, some have been at the industry level with Transcelerate, and more recently with the Data and Informatics Initiative. And what excites me about decentralized trials is just seeing an opportunity of bringing together the value from data and the value from operations, and how can we help look at ways to drive and optimize scientific discovery, trial efficiency, and patient centricity. With that, I'll hand it over to Craig.
Thanks so much, Kim. My name is Craig Lipset. I today serve as the co-chair for the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, DTRA. I serve as an advisor and board member with a number of different organizations as well. All of my time and energy is focused on the same challenge. How do we identify and scale smarter new ways to develop medicines, to engage patients and conduct our clinical trials? My advising work is inclusive with a number of health systems and nonprofits. I serve as the vice president at the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, as well as adjunct assistant professor in health informatics at Rutgers University. I think today's topic is going to be a fascinating discussion because, like Kim, I've spent so much of my time looking at different collaboration spaces, whether groups like Transcelerate. Today I'm on an advisor to IEEE and to HL7, and where can these collaborations help to address some of our shared challenges, and what's the most expansive thinking of standard that we can imagine that can really help us to make execution easier. And I guess it's easy for me to kick over now to my friend Lollo Eriksson. Good to see you, Lollo.
Well, thank you, and thanks everybody for attending. So my name is Lollo Eriksson. I'm a clinical pharmacologist by training, and also have some academic affiliations at Lund University and Rutgers University. I spent most of my life with Mother Merck, as we call her, Merck & Company, at different places around the globe, heading up clinical pharmacology in Scandinavia, late phase development in Europe, and also now in Latin America. I have a passion for operationalizing protocols, trying to understand how you actually conduct a study over multiple countries in an efficient way, how you engage with patients, and how you crack that code of getting patients into a trial in a professional and ethical way. I'm excited about all the new technologies that is maturing out there, and how that can impact how we run clinical trials in a much better way, and actually turn the evaluation process of new drugs, not focusing on the pre-registration activities, but the entire sort of life cycle of a drug. And I think the means has now matured to be applied both pre-registration and also after registration. And the combination of objective data captured by different digital health technologies in combination with subjective sort of data processing directly from the patients is just very, very encouraging. And looking forward to this discussion today and all the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you for the introductions, and I am in very rich company here. So just a call out to the audience. We are interested in your questions. Please drop them in the chat and I'll be monitoring that over time. We do have a number of topics we wanted to cover, so I'll just set a little bit of context. Those of you who have been working in clinical trials know that over the past couple of years, we've had this big upsurge in the use of DCT methodologies. Some of it was adaptive to the pandemic conditions, and not all of it was planned. That is, not all of the protocols were written to use these methodologies in mind. That said, we did prove that those things could work and were useful. And from that evidence, I think we're seeing that drive to try more. However, it's still kind of new, and we're still a little bit in experimental mode in that not everything is exactly clear. So today we really wanted to talk about what are the standards if they exist, what might be coming, what would be useful, and we'll talk a little bit about regulations and guidance on DCTs, what exists, what might exist someday soon. Whether or not there are standards or maybe even some new topics to consider for standardization, and then how you operationalize when things are not exactly standard across all the different components of the trial system. So I want to start with, how would you each define a standard? Because it might not be the same. Who wants to begin?
So, Jane,
sorry.
I guess
Yeah,
I
go
would.
ahead.
Oh, sorry, Lollo.
Yeah,
After
go
you,
ahead.
my friend.
Go ahead.
Now we're going to be awkwardly polite to one another, Jane. So I'd say that, I would think for this conversation about a standard in two different ways. To me, there's standard with a capital S. There are standards that we have and we rely on as study operators for data norms and for other areas. These standards are created by standard setting bodies. There is a known process for how to create a standard, the inclusive nature that it has to follow, systems in place for how that standard is distributed, shared, and kept dynamic in terms of being refreshed and updated. I think they're about groups like CDISC, HL7, IEEE, standard setting bodies that do this, whether it's for data or processes. But then we have standards with a little s. We have standards that may be best practices that just become normalized, and they become a part of our fabric. And they become that way because, well, let's face it, we're an incestuous community. We recycle many of the same people from place to place. One day you're at a large pharma, the next day you're at a small biotech, the next day you're at a CRO, the next day you're at a tech company. Jane, I feel like I just described yours and my career path over the last 15, 20 years that we've known each other. And we all bring these different learnings and experiences from one to the next, and it kind of creates a de facto standard, a best practice that starts to emerge as we're all working in this ecosystem and sharing with one another. These are not confidentiality breaches. I'm not talking about carrying SOPs from one to the next, but the best practice and know-how does travel. So I think there's this range of what we may think of as a standard, whether a tight definition or one that's a little more expansive and reflects the range of best practices we can come to know. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation that we can respect the former and acknowledge the important work it does, but let's also be expansive on the latter and think about standards in the broadest way imaginable.
I would echo everything Craig said, and maybe just say what a standard is not, in my perspective. I think sometimes standards gets a bad name or a bad reputation, but I actually think a standard can be somewhat freeing and can be the foundational to allowing innovation and really allowing us to explore where should we be customizing, where should we be driving change, where should we be, providing optionality. But there's some things that are more standardized, whether formally or, as Craig said, best practice, to enable us to have those efficiencies, have the quality we need, and to really be able to move forward with the integrity of the data and the experience that there should be allowed.
Yeah, let me put my 2 cents on to what Kim and Craig were saying. I definitely agree with the big S and the small s, and I certainly think that there are needs for standardization in different areas of DCT. Certainly the data processing and the data flow may require a certain approach to standardization, whereas other operational means can be standardized in a different way. I'm a simple man. I want to be pragmatic, and I hate these sort of heavy standardized documents that is legal and authority influence. They're just very heavy to go through sometimes. But a standard to me is a process diagram, where you can easily visualize how things are going to be conducted, and follow with the guidance documents that people can easily absorb. Those are the kind of standards that I think we should aim for in many of the areas where DCT operates. Having said that, I also recognize that HL7 and CD's approach or like approach are necessary in some of the areas that we're going to talk about today.
I'm muted. I think that's an interesting distinction. So to Craig's point, CDISC may have some data standards, whereas the collection modality might be different, right? So you can have a set of standards that you operationalize to in a consistent way without saying everyone must use exactly the same device. And I think that's some of the tension we're dealing with as we are working together to drive DCT methods into the norm. Craig, I had one follow-up question, and it's more of a philosophical question. So we're working with a whole lot of people within the DTRA, similar to Transcelerate, and I know you worked a lot on what was and wasn't a standard there. Do you think DTRA is going to set standards, or do you think that, and maybe that's something different than a standard?
So that's certainly a great question. Transcelerate is not a standard setting body. And if Transcelerate's lawyer, who knows me very well, happens to ever listen to this replay, let it be known that I acknowledge that. In practice, DTRA is not created as a standard setting body. Transcelerate isn't a standard setting body for a number of reasons, one of which is the composition of its membership. If for members of your audience that aren't familiar with Transcelerate, it is an important collaboration whose constituents are the large biopharmaceutical companies, the research sponsors. And it would be hard for them, because of the makeup of that body, to be a group of buyers in a category to create a standard. Just creates all sorts of challenges in terms of securities and remaining competitive. It's hard for a group of buyers alone to create a standard. That's where multi-stakeholder collaborations come in. Many of those same pharma get involved in standard setting bodies, but they have to be a little more diverse in terms of their constituents. And to your point, Jane, DTRA has that diversity. We are an organization, a nonprofit collaboration whose members are pharma and site networks and service providers and tech companies and a number of government agencies and health systems and advocacy groups. Where I see DTRA in the near term, though, is leaned in more around best practices and how can we elevate and share where stakeholders in our ecosystem have solved a challenge. What may be a vexing issue to one stakeholder may be something, and very likely is something, that another member of this community has been able to address. Or how can we, through transparency and education and sharing of information and myth busting through data and evidence, help just make it easier for everyone to be able to implement at scale? But you raise such important questions here, Jane. You know, we operate in like one of the world's biggest shared economies, right? When I was at Pfizer, when you were at Roche Genentech, we didn't own sites. When Lollo was at Merck, right? We don't own the sites, we don't own the patients, we don't own the systems that are used for health data capture in those environments. And even if we're introducing things that leverage a data standard, meaning we're using an EDC platform or some other data capture tool that makes it easier to move data downstream and into other systems, we still have this cacophony of different processes and requirements that we're throwing down on sites. And much of that is what still creates chaos for sites that are trying to navigate and work across different sponsors for different studies, are little differences that make us at one sponsor or CRO think that our process and protocol is that much more savvy and smart than the next one. Those little differences stack up to chaos for sites that are meant to be leading the way and working across multiple sponsors. And I think these are areas that are ripe for us to do better with best practices, or standard with a little s.
So Kim, I'm curious, as you work with study teams to navigate them through this process, how have they established common processes, or as we would call them in the tech world, workflows, to help manage that chaos that Craig mentioned?
It's a great question. And I think, you know, historically, oftentimes the study team is sort of thinking about, you know, their protocol, their operational strategy, you know, their patient population, and sort of having to reinvent the wheel each time. They're having to think through almost what seems like at ground zero. Meanwhile, there's a vast ecosystem outside of the study team, outside of the company, that's constantly evolving. And I think especially as technology has really grown up, decentralized trials, remote monitoring, digital health, it's really hard to know, you know, keep abreast of what's happening externally, as well as, you know, how patient preferences are changing and so forth. So, you know, some of the ways that study teams are doing that is to try to have some more centralization around, you know, make sure we're having that knowledge sharing. I think, you know, as Craig alluded to earlier, standards with the small s is very much about knowledge sharing, and we really should be capturing those best practices and building on those rather than starting from scratch and working in individual silos. So a lot of it is knowledge sharing. How are we capturing that? The other thing is, you know, starting to explore, you know, how can we make sure that as we are looking at technologies, as we are looking at new decentralized approaches, really grounding that in the patient journey, grounding that in the, you know, the scientific objectives, and, you know, also with the understanding of what are some of the constraints, you know, timelines, budget. And so having people think more about sort of the fit for purpose, fit for patient solutions, and then building those into the protocol. And I'll say, you know, our goal is to have these things being discussed at the concept stage, at the design stage. It's so much more challenging once you have a protocol, once you have, you know, things sort of starting to build out in the documentation around a study, to then go backwards and try and retrofit all of this work. It really needs to be thought of at the beginning. So it's about having, you know, internal almost consultants who understand the external space, who understand, you know, maybe more broadly some of the different patient populations where different solutions may optimize their journey, may support them through their trial experience. And having those consultants, those partners, help think through the design of a protocol and then help navigate some of the vendor landscape and then support that implementation. I would also say it's about having data people involved early. It's not just about the operational plan, the protocol, but it's also understanding how the data fits together, all the different vendors potentially that you may bring into a trial. How do you make sure you optimize those workflows, as you said, as well as those data flows? And make sure you have all the right information you need from those data flows. Data standards is one thing, but you also need to have information about what device was capturing those data, because some of that feeds into, the ultimate output and enable that harmonization. So I think it's just a matter of expanding the group of players who maybe were involved before and making sure there is that partnership and that knowledge sharing.
Lollo, I think you've been thinking about this too, maybe from a similar and yet from a different angle. So
yeah, no, definitely. I think when we're talking about DCT, it feels, at least for me, overwhelming. And some of the colleagues that I've interacts with on a day-to-day basis also have that same feeling, because DCT is not one concept. It's not one type of approach. DCT, when you start dissecting it, it is all different kind of operational setups. And as we all have learned, if things feels overwhelming and heavy to work with, you need to break it down in bits and pieces. And therefore, I am a proponent of trying to identify different tiers of studies that fall into the different buckets. So tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 studies, for example, where tier 1 is classified and agreed upon according to certain definitions, and tier 2 and tier 3 have a similar definitions and standards. And when you have those tiers, it's so much easier to then start talking about how a protocol template, for example, is going to look like for a tier 1 study. And I'll give you one example. If you have an observational study where you're taking data from an electronic health record system or a federated EHR system, and you supplement that with subjective data coming directly from the patient via a validated eCOA system, that is a very different study as compared to a breast cancer controlled clinical trial, where you may have some virtual sites in combination with classical clinical trial sites that is equipped with the modern technologies. And you may also have some external sort of healthcare partners or in-home evaluations and things. That's a whole different kind of study and a whole different set of stakeholders that needs to interact. So I think in order for us to make it simple, I think we need to dissect it and then make definitions for each of the tiers when it comes to protocols, when it comes to IT systems and digital health technologies that is most often sort of applicable in the different teams. And if you had that, it would be so much easier for the study teams to interact. And I think I also want to spin on a thing that Kim was mentioning. So the cross-functional planning teams that sponsors and CROs is applying usually call in the people that is inside the organizations. But now when we're dealing with DCTs, you need to get out in the external world because you need to develop the protocols in collaboration with patients, with investigators, with healthcare providers, if the tier is defined to also engage an external healthcare provider, right? And you also need to interact with the authorities. And I think I'm not going to go ahead of the questioning here, but I really want us to come to how do we interact with authorities? What's the protocol to actually follow to interact with not just the FDA and EMA, but also other authorities, maybe with ethics committees, because I think sponsors are having some ambiguity on what the regulators is going to say eventually about my trial when it comes to the market application and approval, right? Did I choose the right digital endpoint? Is it valid? And so I stopped there for the moment, but I think breaking it down, making sort of standardizations within each of these buckets, and try to sort of both from a operational perspective, protocol development perspective, and the technology perspective, that I think could be very helpful.
I'm going to go back to Kim for a second, and then Craig, you're up, because I'm going to dig a little on this regulatory can of worms. So Kim, I really am interested in Lollo's thinking about the tiering of studies, and honestly, I haven't tried that. But I'm curious, do you and your teams have a guideline or a decision-making framework for what fits when?
We're working on it. I think there's still a lot more we know. And I think we don't want to become so set that this means this, and X means Y, and Z means Q, and so forth. But we're learning. And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about making sure we're sharing across, and making sure there are sort of people that are not just looking at one study, but they're looking across studies, or looking across different patient populations, different indications, different molecules. It's not going to be one-to-one, and there may be trends across things that we wouldn't necessarily look at before, that you would learn if you were in one particular space in the company. So we are definitely trying to better understand, are there things about patients that we know that would make them a good match for certain types of digital health tools, or different types of measures, or are there preferences for different patients that, as they go through their trial, that would support their experience, support broader access. So I think we're early-ish on in that journey of starting to develop those trends, but I love the idea of it. I do think we are going to have to come into a framework. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point of standards, to go back to the question, but I do think a framework so that we can be more efficient and more effective in how we are pairing different technologies, different approaches with the trials that we're running.
You unpacked a lot there, and I'm very interested in how we can collectively learn this. So I'll just make maybe the obvious request, which is, as sponsors are thinking about how things might fit and when they are more useful, please call the tech providers, because we are working across multiple therapeutic areas and may not have the same therapeutic knowledge as the sponsors, but I think that's where that collaboration can be powerful. To Lollo's point, it's that cross ecosystem perspective of how we make the best decisions with the knowledge at hand. So, Craig, regulations, big can of worms last week at DTRA, and you got to speak to 3 of the policymakers from 3 different countries on where their thinking is and where they're headed next. So if you have a couple of takeaways and also a couple of if onlys, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, Jane. So we did have this chance at the DTRA annual meeting to spend time with Leonard Sachs from CEDAR at the FDA, with Dita Zerland Christensen from EMA, and she's with the Danish Medicines Agency, but is the project manager for the EMA on their guidance, and with Catherine Ella from the Israeli Ministry of Health, who's the director of the clinical trials office there. And the topic for our conversation was exactly this, was around decentralized trials and how adoption is working on their side, where we might expect to see guidance, where might we expect to see harmonization in some of these areas. I think first and foremost, it's fascinating that at baseline, the regulators, like many operators, consider this just to be a set of tools and methods, many of which we've been using for a very long time. And so collecting data in a decentralized way, well, we've been doing ePro with patients outside of a clinic for some time. There are known pathways for many of these things. Some of the concerns, though, that current models raise are around the training and the staffing, the people, the oversight around the different individuals who have responsibility for patient safety and data integrity in these different studies and in these different models. And as we're seeing more and more engagement with healthcare providers in the community, whether for image acquisition, specimens, or even supporting study visits, what's the expectation around training and oversight to keep us having confidence in this space? Now, as I mentioned, one of our speakers is working on the guidance document from Europe, and she's very confident around their schedule. But the FDA, it's still a bit of a work in progress. They'll point to their DHT, their Digital Health Technologies guidance, and say, learn what you can from there. We've got our guidance for trials running during COVID. The DCT guidance is a work in progress for them. But interestingly, as we think about harmonization, smaller markets like Israel are watching and waiting. They're watching what Europe and the US put out, and they will adapt those to fit their environment. So in some ways, guidance from some of those markets does turn into a bit of a standard with a little s, but then some of this is already going through the latest ICH revisions, the International Conference on Harmonization, where the regulators bring these approaches together. Now, it's interesting. In one panel at DTRA, somebody brought up this question of even the term site. Does the definition of site still even resonate today in a world where the patient could be in their car and the investigator could be in their car and they're having a visit together? What's a visit? What is a site? And it was interesting even bringing that back to the regulator, saying, is our language keeping up? And in the eyes of the regulator, that's a you problem, right? That the regs don't even describe a definition of site in the US. You people at pharma and at CROs and tech companies are the ones busily defining what is a site. They just need addresses for certain functions. Where is the data being collected? Where do inspectors have to go? They're less concerned about some of this. But Jane, what that a final note, what that reminds me of is when we have different language, it gets in the way of how we're communicating with one another, including with regulators. It slows us down. And so we do have, I guess, one bit of a standard with a lowercase s from DTRA, and that's our glossary. And I think the more we as a community are engaging with regulators and others using common language, it hopefully can make this process together a little easier, right? The probability that two groups are going to the regulators with the exact same question and each looking like it's something new, when in fact, if we were using the same language, we could start to see patterns and we can start to make it easier for different stakeholders to answer questions and have more confidence in saying yes about a new approach, because it turns out it's not a new approach. You were just using a new word to describe something that was already known and familiar to them.
I think the terminology is really one of those things that complicates the issue. And if we have a moment at the end, I'm going to share my screen so people can see where the DTRA glossary is housed. But I also recall from that conversation you had with the regulators, I think it was Dr. Ella, if I've got her name correct, who said that in Israel, they're running a pilot and they called for sponsors to ask questions and contribute and really collaborate on this. And she said it was not as collaborative as she had hoped. So I'm wondering, do we have evidence that sponsors are asking opinions? And if so, what comes out of those conversations with regulators? They're not standards, but they are guidance.
So it's interesting, right? Information flows in lots of directions and it originates in different directions. When we surveyed DTRA members as to whether they have engaged with the FDA on using a DCT approach, whether for a COVID or a non-COVID study in the last 2 years, the overwhelming majority have engaged with the FDA about their studies, about their concerns, about their questions. When the regulators are coming back to the ecosystem saying, well, we want to learn too, we have questions. We saw this, as you mentioned, with Catherine Ella from Israel saying they put out a call, they got crickets. The FDA last year, the Oncology Center of Excellence put out a call asking organizations when they're doing submissions to flag which data elements were captured using decentralized methods and approaches. They got next to nothing. Now they're shifting to more of a survey-based approach. And so when we survey again DTRA members, they are going to the regulators with questions, they're getting information answered, and they're building confidence to move forward. But I think we also have to be equally respectful that when the regulators have questions and they're looking for information, we have to rise to that call. And so far, the regulators are coming back to us saying, you're not sharing back with us. We need to learn. We have questions that we need answered so we can sustain confidence with these approaches.
So do we need a think tank day on the Hill?
Well, I think on the Hill points to the policymakers.
Mhm.
And it's fascinating that 3 pieces of federal legislation in the United States in the last year have included the words decentralized clinical trial, whereas, you know, in the decades of history of clinical research, those words have never been mentioned in a piece of policy. 2 of those, one of those was the updated version of the Cures Act. The other 2 were pieces of legislation around diversity, the Diverse Trials Act and the DEPICT Act, both of which focused on clinical trial inclusiveness, also called out decentralized. I don't think that's a bad thing to certainly go back on and make sure that policymakers are aware. But here the regulators have questions and we need to organize ourselves better to make sure that we're engaging and answering them. We need groups like DTRA together with ACRO, together with Transcelerate, to come together and to speak with a clear voice on areas where there are shared interests across this community, and to make sure that if the regulators have questions that we're rising to that challenge and helping them to get their information.
I think this is very interesting what Craig is saying, just that the communication of this topic is not as enriched as we want and as frequent as we want, right? And I go back to some of the Nordic countries sort of work in this space have come out with recently, including the Danish authority, but also the recommendations that CTTI is making, and everybody is sort of encouraging the sponsors to open up this dialogue, because there are uncertainties, there are no clear answers in certain areas that for the regulators that they may have to take a look at, and certainly answers that the sponsors need. So this is why I was asking or promoting a more firm protocol on how that interaction between the sponsor and the authorities is preferably going to look like, right? The end of phase 1, for example, that can reveal certain things that the authorities may provide some guidelines on, and also for the sponsors to follow up on. The end of phase 2, the pre-phase 3 interactions, and equally important, what you do after the approval has been obtained. So I think if we could have that dialogue going much more frequent, that there's the comfort level at the sponsor, I imagine, and Kim can respond to that, would increase. The authorities would also have better visibility into what a sponsor's development program is going to look like, and what kind of DCT elements is being used in the early stage of the development and in the later stage of the development. I would imagine that you use certain sort of DHTs and other means in the very early stage, you expand it into the phase 3, And then you may even be much more liberal in the post-approval phase in order to get real-world data. So I think that dialogue is extremely important.
I definitely agree that I think having more opportunity for guidance and conversation would increase confidence. And I do, kind of going back to what I said earlier, I sometimes think standards and guidelines, especially from health authority bodies, sometimes do feel like restrictions, or they feel like, you know, things you must follow. And I think we need to shift the relationship. And I know there's a lot of efforts that are doing that, but that comfort level of, you know, a lot of this is uncharted for all of us, and it needs to be more of a partnership and a brainstorming and as you said, a think tank to evolve and create. And the guidelines are not meant to be restrictive or limiting, but they're actually meant to be accelerating and enabling. And we need to maybe just shift our mindsets and that partnership, that relationship, and hopefully that will then also evolve this to being more give take versus, you know, just taking the answers to our questions and not necessarily being able to co-create with people, you know, groups we maybe haven't had that opportunity or taken the opportunity for in the past.
So I'm hearing that there has to be less passivity, and that's a really negative word, but it has to be more of an interactive dialogue than just waiting for guidance to come and say, lo and behold, this is the way that things will happen. I do want to make just a comment, because there is a Regulatory Affairs Council that is affiliated to the DTRA. And actually, Kim, one of your colleagues, is the leader of that council, Rasika. And her vision is that the DTRA Regulatory Affairs Council will work with the DTRA member organizations to start building what I would call a decision tree or a workflow of when would you go ask a question, like at what point in time and on what topic in your development planning, to Lolo's point, and what is already clear. Like maybe it's clear, but it's not clear because it's not written down in a place where you know it exists. To Craig's point, like we don't have a centralized guidance, and yet we have DPICT and we have the Cures Act and we have the DHT guidance. So there's a lot of signals here, but it's not one document. So we'll see where they get to with that. I'm super excited about that. I'm literally turning the page here. Let's talk about sites. Sites are also trying to navigate this world of DCTs and new requirements, and not exactly sure, from what I can tell, about where their responsibilities start and end in this new world. So who wants to weigh in on that topic?
Sites are definitely struggling, I think, many with regards to decentralized, and two of the areas that jump to mind have to do with oversight in terms of ensuring that they can demonstrate they're fulfilling their responsibilities related to patient safety and data integrity, as well as the challenges that they face with a cacophony of different technologies, systems, and tools that are being thrust down on them. I think that these are both interesting areas for us as we're thinking about this topic of standards today. I think when we're thinking about that latter point around this range of different tech and tools, this is a great use case for us as it relates to standards. When I was at Pfizer and we did our first e-consent project, I remember distinctly the large health system that called us back when we were rolling out our first pilot. They called us back and said, e-consent, great idea. We use platform X at our institution for all of our e-consent. Thanks for the suggestion. Click. And, you know, it was sort of this epiphany that consent obviously is a relationship between the investigator and that institution and the patient. We as a sponsor have certain language and we have certain responsibility as it relates to oversight. The tools and systems that are used should be left to the site. And yet today, our e-consent model is pushing down unfamiliar tech and tools on sites that are already stressed, many of whom already have a system or a tool in place. And so by leveraging standards, how might we start to define minimum quality standards for what is an acceptable e-consent at a site, and standards related to the interoperability of signatures, dates, and versions, so that we as sponsors and CROs can fulfill our obligation, have that oversight that we need. But if a site has a tool that's acceptable, let them use it. This is quality by design. And if a site doesn't have an appropriate tool, then we provision, right? And so how can we start to leverage standards in ways that let sites bring more of the technology that they have, or bring more of the tech in which they invest? I think we can start to think the same way as it relates to oversight, but certainly a lot trickier there. There we have to start to develop more norms and best practices, because today it is extremely hard for a site to build confidence with a third-party visiting nurse service or an unfamiliar patient monitoring platform and come away with the confidence that that they are able to demonstrate and fulfill their obligations as it relates to oversight. Kim, I think we might have lost Jane, but what are some of your thoughts on this topic of wherefore art thou site, and how can we start to address some of their pain points?
Yeah, no, and definitely what you were saying about sort of what is the end goal we're trying to achieve, and where do we push down, and why are we pushing down? And I think your point around enabling this flexibility, and again, going back to, this is an ecosystem where we all need to adjust. It's not the same, we can't keep the same model we've had for the many years of clinical research to date, but we need to really think about how do we evolve this ecosystem holistically, and sites are included in that, patients are included in that. And I think it's about, exactly to your point around looking at the interoperability of the output and the quality of what's being collected, and think about, what's the minimum standard or the minimum guidelines to be able to get to that point, and then to allow the flexibility and the how to drive it forward. I also think it's about, as we do decentralization, maybe the role of the site will shift. What capabilities, what skills will need to be adjusted at the site level to be able to partner with some of these more decentralized remote things. Maybe the sites are the ones that are then, enabling the remote monitoring, and maybe those come back. So I think there's a lot of different ways we could explore. I think we shouldn't be limited to what has been, but to really sit down and look forward about the direction we're going. And what does that mean for everybody's role, and that partnership and the conversations we should be having.
And Lollo, I'm thinking back to your tiering. The nature of the sites in those different tiers might be a little different. I can't hear Lollo. Can you hear Lollo?
Lollo's on mute.
Yes, thank you. I was on mute. Sorry for that. Yeah, thank you for that, Jane. And I think, sorry if I sort of sounds as a broken record here, but I'm coming back to the architectural design and the people that is around that table. Because if we have external providers and mobile providers and others, the investigator influence and input need to be taken care of in the very early stage of the design. Because as you point out, Craig, I mean, whether an assessment of a trial patient is being done at the central clinical trial clinic where the PI reside, or if it's out in the remote area, the investigator is ultimately responsible to make sure that that patient is well taken care of, the safety is protected, and that the data integrity and validity is and that the sampling of the procedure, whatever it is, diagnostic or blood samples, that the people is actually authorized to do it and trained to do it as per the protocol. So I think the input from the investigators, the external healthcare providers, and patients as well is so essential in when you're putting the blueprint together.
And I was reading a white paper on e-consent just this morning because, yes, I'm a nerd, but actually the verification of the individual who's consenting to be in the trial and their identity is a fundamental. So that would be a small s standard, right? How you do it might be a little bit different depending on the trial, depending on the investigator, but that is something that we must hold as a truism as part of the research process, right? So I think that's where teams really do find that it's kind of complicated. And yet this is why the subtext is what's new and what's not. We've always had to verify the identity of patients. We just did it in person before. Okay, we are almost out of time. I don't see any questions. Oh, wait, maybe one question. Yes, I do. How do you get the data to assess sites' needs and determine which ones belong in each tier? Oh, that's interesting, because I was thinking about GCP ICH just now. There's actually no specific way that is set out to qualify sites, except to say that the investigator must be appropriately qualified. The how is something that we created a whole lot of process around. So Kim, how would your study teams go about determining which sites were research ready for which tier?
And I apologize for the dog barking in the background. You know, we always do a feasibility assessment. I think that's something that it's just traditionally done in clinical trials. But I think one of the things we're exploring is how do we evolve the feasibility assessment to be something that is inclusive of some of these new approaches. You know, are sites set up to do digital measures? What are they, you know, what are their current e-consent systems if they have any? So it's just evolving the feasibility to be more inclusive of some of these new practices is something. Again, from there, I think having gathering that information and starting to look at trends, starting to look at tiers and seeing if there's trends, and starting to see if there are ways that we can make archetypes of sites, you know, large scale institutions, smaller community sites. You know, what does this look like? And are there some things we can do to start, again, making recommendations of what to use when from that site perspective? There's a number of incredible, you know, site sort of perspective bodies that I think it's just continuing the partnership and getting those perspectives, both on individual study levels, but I think more importantly on the macro scale, you know, just making sure as these, you know, ways of working continue, as decentralization becomes more and more part of our practice, getting that feedback, getting that perspective, and making sure that we're moving in direction in partnership with sites and reflecting their needs in our evolution of clinical research, and not diverging and in kind of working in a vacuum or in a bubble that's getting farther and farther from those work. So like Society for Clinical Research Sites, I know City, you know, Transcelerate, all of these groups have site partnerships, and I think it's just continuing to have those conversations as well.
That's such a great point, Kim, and I know so many sites are keen for transparency around what sponsors and CROs are looking for here, because so many are struggling to make their own investments. If I owned a site, should I be investing in e-consent? Should I be training staff to do home visits? Or do you just want me to have SOPs that show that I'm comfortable working across those, or I have my own expectations and I can communicate them as a site? I mentioned at the maybe in the intro, I was just finished up as vice chair at the MedStar Health Research Institute, and they did an inventory like so many others of how many decentralized methods have we used on our own studies in recent years, our own visiting nurses, our own e-consent, our own video. Is that what sponsors want? For them to come forward and say, we have all this capability, or do sponsors want them to park that and just use study specific tech that's being presented? So these are important conversations to have. And I think groups like you're mentioning with SCRS, with ACRP, are just in City important stakeholders, as you're mentioning, to make sure that we're communicating what these expectations look like for sites.
And I think just to add a little bit to that, so I think what our colleague is asking for is also how do we ensure that non-traditional sites can can be included in the setup for a clinical trial, right? And as you well know, the care provision is having all different kind of processes to follow and workflows to follow. So understanding what the workflow is in different care settings in the community is important, because if you break in and have certain sort of assessments being done remotely, and it sort of disrupt the workflow, that will cause some issues as well. So care workflow management and understanding of that is also important.
I'm glad you mentioned that. We're not going to get to this topic today, so it may be another webinar in our future, and that is the differences in how you execute these tools in different parts of the world, which is I'm not sure will ever be standardized, but I do think there's a way forward to use the tools. And it's to your point, Lollo, understanding what's the standard of practice and how does the use of the methodology fit in or get a little bit of friction with the DCT method. So we'll park that for today, but
Yeah.
it's a big one.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of DTRA work streams who are trying to help not create standards, but make more visible what is known. Let's put it that way.
Right. Can I interject just one quick thing?
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to my operational part of my heart here, right? So there's many benefits with DCTs, and it's being adopted as we speak here today, and it's here to stay. And the benefits are all different kind of things with in enhancing the patient experience, reducing the trial cost and timelines to execute a development program, and most of all, representative sampling of patients, right, which has been a major trouble in the past, compliance to protocol and so forth. And I think it's very important when we talk about standardization to also be able to have some simple measures in place, the KPIs that can actually monitor that, because we're going to learn from the KPIs that we collect and include that in our sort of updating of guidelines and things. And I know you guys have thought about that in DCTRA and other institutions as well.
Actually, that was the perfect segue, because I am going to try to share a screenshot of the DTRA website. Oh, there it is. This is the glossary, and you can see it's at dtra.org under the resources tab. So the resources tab includes the glossary, a best practices handbook, and 2 patient journey maps. And I want to just call them out because although they're not standards per se, I think they are actually the beginning of a framework to help study teams understand what it takes to execute these new methods. And I'll just say, if you have questions about those, please reach out to secretariat@dtra.org. because we'll help you navigate that. But I also want to say thank you very much to Kim, to Lollo, and to Craig. I think we got started on a topic that actually has quite a lot of meat left. So maybe we'll come back to this in 6 months or so and see what changed and where we're headed.
Thanks, Jane, for bringing us together.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
very
thanks so
much.
much.
And thanks to everybody listening in.
Bye.